At 7:16 a.m., Emma Collins walked past something she had seen hundreds of times before. A few seconds later, she continued on with her day. She didn't stop. She didn't take a second look. She didn't tell anyone about it. Because there was nothing unusual about it. At least that's what she believed. 6 months later, detectives would ask her to retrace every step she took that morning. Every turn, every conversation, every detail. And somewhere inside those ordinary moments, investigators believed the answer had been waiting the entire time. What makes this story remarkable isn't how complicated it was. It's how simple it was. Because when the truth finally emerged, people didn't react with disbelief. They reacted with shock. Not because the answer was impossible to find, but because it had been visible from the very beginning. The detail was there. The clue was there. The evidence was there. And nobody understood what they were looking at. Not Emma Collins. Not Detective Nathan Brooks. Not the friends, neighbors, and family members who would later spend months trying to understand what happened. The answer existed in plain sight. And yet somehow, everyone missed it. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how all of this began, you first need to understand Emma Collins. At 46 years old, Emma lived the kind of life that rarely attracted attention. She taught elementary school in a small American town where people knew each other by name and where routines rarely changed. Every morning followed a familiar pattern. She woke up at the same time, took the same route to work, passed the same buildings, saw the same faces. It was a life built on predictability, which is precisely why what happened next felt so impossible to understand. Because nothing dramatic happened that morning. There was no emergency, no confrontation, no suspicious stranger, no warning that a mystery was already unfolding around her. The object she walked past wasn't hidden. It wasn't locked away. It wasn't buried in some remote location waiting to be discovered. It sat exactly where it always had. Visible, ordinary, forgettable. The kind of thing people pass every day without paying attention. And that was the problem. Human beings are remarkably good at noticing things that seem unusual, but we often ignore things that feel familiar. Our brains learn to filter them out. We stop seeing what we've seen 1,000 times before. We assume that because something has always been there, it must be unimportant. That assumption would eventually become central to everything that followed. Because while Emma continued her morning routine, another story was already beginning elsewhere in town. A story that would soon involve a missing person. A story that would attract investigators, local media attention, and countless theories. A story that would leave an entire community searching for answers. At first, nobody connected those two things. Why would they? What could a missing person possibly have to do with an ordinary object sitting in plain sight? The connection seemed impossible. Even when clues began emerging, nobody understood how they fit together. Weeks passed, then months. The investigation expanded. Detective Nathan Brooks followed leads that appeared promising before ending in dead ends. Witnesses came forward. Rumors spread. Questions multiplied. Yet the most important clue remained untouched. Waiting. Visible to everyone. Meaningful to nobody. What makes this case fascinating is that investigators later discovered there was never a shortage of evidence. The shortage was understanding. People saw the clue. They simply didn't recognize it as a clue. And that's a very different thing. Imagine looking directly at the answer to a mystery and never realizing what you're seeing. Imagine discovering later that the key to everything was sitting quietly in the background while everyone searched somewhere else. That is exactly what happened here. Months after that morning, when investigators finally connected the missing person case to a photograph nobody thought mattered, the entire story changed. Suddenly, old assumptions collapsed. Suddenly, forgotten details became important. Suddenly, people started remembering things they had dismissed as irrelevant. And when Detective Nathan Brooks finally reconstructed the timeline, he discovered something that left even experienced investigators stunned. The answer had been sitting in plain sight from the very beginning. Which brings us back to the question that nobody could answer at the time. What exactly did Emma Collins walk past at 7:16 a.m. that morning? And why would something so ordinary eventually become the most important clue in the entire case? At first, nobody connected the pieces. Not Emma Collins. Not the police. Not even the people closest to the case. That's what made the mystery so frustrating. And ultimately, so remarkable. Because every major clue was visible long before anyone understood its significance. To understand how that happened, you need to understand the people at the center of the story. Emma Collins was 46 years old and had spent most of her life in the same community. As an elementary school teacher, she was known for her patience, attention to detail, and ability to notice things others often overlooked. Students trusted her. Parents respected her. Neighbors liked her. She lived alone in a small home just a few blocks from the school where she worked. Her life followed routines. Predictable routines. The kind of routines that make unusual events stand out immediately. Or at least, that's what people assumed. Because when investigators later reviewed everything Emma saw, everything she experienced, and everything she remembered, they discovered something surprising. Even observant people can overlook the most important details when those details appear ordinary. Then there was Jake Reynolds. Almost everyone in town knew Jake. If there was a community event, Jake was usually there with a camera around his neck. If there was a charity fundraiser, a school event, a parade, or a local celebration, chances were good that Jake had photographed it. People liked him. He was friendly, outgoing, easy to talk to, the type of person who seemed to know everyone. Over the years, he had documented countless moments throughout the town. Birthdays, community gatherings, local festivals, sports events, family celebrations. His photographs appeared everywhere. Social media pages, local newspapers, community bulletin boards. People became so accustomed to seeing Jake's work that they stopped paying attention to individual photographs. They saw the images. They just didn't study them. That fact would later become critically important. The third key figure was Detective Nathan Brooks. When the investigation first landed on his desk, he believed he was dealing with a relatively straightforward case. The evidence pointed in one direction. The timeline appeared to support certain assumptions. Witness statements seemed consistent. There was no reason to suspect that the most important clue had already been sitting in plain sight for months. Like everyone else, Detective Nathan Brooks focused on what seemed important. The problem was that what seemed important wasn't what actually mattered. And that's where the central questions of this story began. Why did a photograph become important months later? What was everyone missing? And how could one tiny detail eventually change the entire case? At the time, nobody knew the answers. What they had instead was a collection of disconnected facts. A missing person, a town searching for explanations, a photographer whose images documented daily life, and a teacher who unknowingly walked past the answer before anyone realized there was even a mystery to solve. Looking back, it seems obvious. But hindsight has a way of making complicated stories appear simple. The reality was very different. Because the clue didn't stand out. It didn't announce itself. It didn't appear suspicious. In fact, if someone had pointed directly at it and asked whether it looked important, most people would have laughed. That's because the clue didn't look like evidence. It looked like background. Something accidental. Something irrelevant. Something your eyes would naturally skip over while focusing on more obvious details. Investigators later described it as one of the most frustrating aspects of the case. The answer wasn't hidden. It wasn't buried. It wasn't protected. It was visible. Completely visible. The challenge wasn't finding it. The challenge was understanding it. And for months, nobody did. Not Emma Collins. Not Jake Reynolds. Not Detective Nathan Brooks. Not the friends, family members, and witnesses who looked directly at the same images countless times. Because the clue didn't look like a clue. And that single fact allowed the truth to remain hidden in plain sight far longer than anyone thought possible. For years, life moved at a predictable pace. That was one of the reasons people loved living there. The town wasn't famous. It wasn't wealthy. It wasn't the kind of place that appeared in national headlines. It was simply home. A small American community where people recognized familiar faces, where local businesses knew their customers by name, and where major events were discussed for weeks because there were so few of them. In many ways, it felt frozen in time, comfortably frozen. And for people like Emma Collins, that predictability was part of the appeal. Emma had spent years building a life centered around routine and connection. As an elementary school teacher, her days revolved around lesson plans, students, parent conferences, and community events. She wasn't someone who sought attention. She preferred quiet mornings, familiar places, and meaningful relationships. People trusted her. Children adored her. Parents respected her. And perhaps most importantly, she genuinely cared about the town she called home. She attended local events, supported school fundraisers, volunteered when help was needed. If something happened in the community, Emma usually knew about it, or at least she thought she did. Because later, when investigators began reconstructing the events surrounding the case, Emma would discover something unsettling. Being close to a community doesn't necessarily mean you see everything happening inside it. Sometimes familiarity can hide important details. Then there was Jake Reynolds. If Emma represented stability, Jake represented visibility. Few people moved through the town more frequently than he did. Camera in hand, Jake documented local life with remarkable consistency. School events, parades, sporting competitions, community celebrations, charity fundraisers, holiday gatherings. Jake photographed them all. His images became part of the town's collective memory. People trusted him, not because he demanded trust, because he was everywhere. And when someone becomes a familiar presence for long enough, they stop attracting attention. That's exactly what happened with Jake. People saw him constantly, yet rarely thought much about him. Looking back later, that detail would become surprisingly important. Because familiarity has a strange effect on human perception. The more often we see something, the less closely we examine it. The town itself operated under the same principle. People felt safe there. Crime was rare. Serious investigations were even rarer. Most residents believed they understood their neighbors. They believed they understood their community. And for the most part, they were right. But every community contains stories people don't fully understand. Conversations they don't hear. Moments they don't witness. Details they overlook. This story was built from those details. The strange part is that the warning signs existed long before anyone realized they mattered. Not dramatic warning signs. Nothing obvious. Nothing that would immediately attract concern. Just small moments. Tiny inconsistencies. Brief events that seemed unrelated at the time. Someone reported seeing an unfamiliar person near a location where they normally wouldn't be. A conversation took place that was later remembered differently by different people. An explanation that sounded reasonable when first heard somehow felt less convincing months later. A forgotten interaction. An overlooked observation. A casual remark that nobody bothered remembering. Individually, none of those things appeared significant. That's why nobody paid attention. Because nothing appeared connected. Human beings naturally search for patterns. But when events seem unrelated, our minds place them into separate categories. One unusual sighting becomes an isolated incident. One contradictory story becomes a simple misunderstanding. One forgotten conversation becomes exactly that. Forgotten. Nobody saw a larger picture because nobody knew there was a larger picture to see. Not Emma Collins. Not Jake Reynolds. Not Detective Nathan Brooks. Not the people who would later spend months trying to understand what happened. The clues existed, but the context didn't. And without context, even important details can seem meaningless. What investigators eventually discovered was that many of the pieces required to solve the mystery had been available from the beginning. The problem wasn't access. The problem was interpretation. People were looking at individual facts. Nobody was looking at relationships between those facts. And that's often how mysteries survive. Not because information is hidden, because information appears ordinary until someone recognizes how it connects to everything else. Months later, Detective Nathan Brooks would describe the case in a way that perfectly captured its complexity. He explained that the hardest part wasn't finding evidence. The hardest part was realizing which evidence mattered. Because once investigators understood where to look, the connections suddenly became impossible to ignore. But at this point in the story, nobody understood that yet. The unusual sightings remained isolated observations. The contradictory stories remained unexplained inconsistencies. The forgotten conversations remained forgotten. And the photograph that would eventually change everything was still sitting quietly in the background, waiting for someone to understand what they were really seeing. Because connections are only obvious after you know where to look. So here's the question. If you had seen that photograph for the very first time, would you have noticed the detail? Would your eyes have drifted toward the background? Would you have questioned something that appeared completely ordinary? Would you have paused long enough to recognize what everyone else missed? Or would you have done exactly what most people did? Would you have looked at the image, seen nothing unusual, and moved on with your day? It's an interesting question because now that you know the ending, the answer seems obvious. The reflection seems important. The clue seems impossible to miss. The connection appears clear. But remember, Emma Collins saw that same photograph. Detective Nathan Brooks saw that same photograph. The community saw that same photograph. And none of them understood what they were looking at until much later. That's what makes stories like this so fascinating. They remind us that the biggest discoveries aren't always hidden behind locked doors or buried beneath layers of complexity. Sometimes they're sitting quietly in plain sight. Sometimes the difference between confusion and understanding comes down to one small detail, one overlooked observation, one moment of attention, and one person willing to look a little closer. So I'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts. If you had been in Emma Collins' position, do you think you would have noticed the clue? Would you have connected the pieces before Detective Nathan Brooks did? Or would you have overlooked it just like everyone else? Let me know in the comments below. Your answer might reveal more than you think. And if you enjoy mysteries where ordinary moments hide extraordinary truths, where small clues lead to life-changing discoveries, and where the ending completely changes the way you see everything that came before, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. Because if you think this story was surprising, wait until you hear about the man who solved a 10-year mystery using a receipt everyone else threw away. For an entire decade, investigators believed the answer had disappeared forever. Witnesses forgot. Evidence dried up. Leads vanished. The case slowly faded into the background. Then one man noticed something on a crumpled receipt that should have been impossible. A tiny detail,